Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from, and a very, very warm welcome. We're going to give people a couple of minutes to join, and then we're going to get started. Warm welcome. Hi, everyone. If you're joining us from the UK, I hope you have your post-lunch coffees ready. If you're joining us from the US, I hope you have your morning coffees ready. Um, well, let's get into it, shall we? Welcome. And if you have attended one of these before, you know what we do here. We talk to experts about all current hot topics related to data literacy, technology, artificial intelligence, and much more. With the midst of what might be a new industrial revolution, we are going to unpack two very, very hot topics and how they're interrelated with some experts in the house. So today we are going to unpack digital disruption and digital transformation in conjuncture and at what it might mean for your business. They're related concepts, but they differ in their focus and implications. And before we dive into further details, let's look a little bit at today's agenda and what to expect in the next 45 minutes. So we're going to kick us off with deconstructing the big buzzword. We're going to deconstruct and understand what digital transformation really means, understand a little bit about its components, its pillars, and of course, being a skills focused and an e-learning organization, we're going to tie that back to why data literacy is an important component of digital transformation. And then I'm going to invite my colleague, Ian Allen, who is our head of business development, to join me on today's series, who is going to be talking to our in-house expert, Tony Moroney. And he is going to be introducing Tony a little bit more in detail later. Tony is a top voice on all things digital transformation, on many things artificial intelligence, and also an academic, a lecturer, just to name a few things that he does. So really, really excited for him to have made time for this. And thank you all for making time to join us today. Um, we are trying to keep today's session as interactive as possible. So please feel free to pop in as many questions as you like in the Q&A panel in Zoom. And we will try to answer them throughout the session, or if not, we would love to leave some time at the end for you to ask your questions to Tony or Ian directly. So let's get into it. Just to add, you can ask your Q&A at the panel on your Zoom, which points out to your Q&A section. And we will also have a few polls just to understand our audiences a little bit better, and to contextualize digital transformation a little bit. Now, this is an interesting one, right? Like, how do you define digital transformation? And just in our chat earlier, when we were inviting Tony to do this, with us. He told us a very interesting nugget that every time he's in a room, in a company or with a board of directors or with a group of C-suite people in the room, and he asks this question to people, he never gets the same answer from two different people. It's always different. There's not necessarily a red thread going on, and I think that is vital or is almost of essence of what digital transformation means. So yeah, feel free to pop in your answers in the chat on what you think digital transformation means or how you would define it, especially in context of your business and industry. And with that, right, just to establish that digital transformation is more than just a buzzword. Let's understand digital disruption a little bit before. It refers to almost this transformative effect of emerging digital technologies on not just industries, on businesses, even on societal norms. It's almost like a digital earthquake, shaking up all the traditional structures. It's creating seismic shifts in how things have been done or things are done presently. Um, this phenomenon is characterized by like technological advancement. It can render existing business models obsolete. It can create not just threats, but also new opportunities for businesses that are quickly able to pivot and understand. And it's 2024, right? It's Digital disruption will continue to reshape industries. It might force organizations to either be left behind in the digital dust or really embrace change and ride the spiral. So, what is the difference between digital disruption and transformation? While digital disruption describes the external forces, the environment outside, which is reshaping industries, markets, digital transformation is almost looking inward, the internal initiatives at a business level that is undertaken by organizations to adapt and to thrive in the digital age. Now, surprisingly, a lot of people will confuse digital transformation with only technology adoption. Like, let's get a CRM, let's get Salesforce. And they will almost, in that sense, limit it to an IT department initiative. But on the other hand, there is hence no single definition that applies. And it is so contextual to what industry you're in, what business you're in, but broadly, it does refer to the process of integrating digital technologies into all aspects of your business, almost into the DNA of the business. And it's a continuous process. It's not an initiative that can just be started and left off, and it almost needs to run through the lifeblood of the business in multiple ways. So let's understand a little bit more about what it is that sort of adds up or forms the key pillars or the key backbone of digital transformation. And briefly, you can just categorize it into cultural operating models slash processes, skills, which is obviously the piece that we are very, very involved in, and technology, of course. So culture, quite underrated, but cultural transformation is almost fostering a digital first mindset across the organization. You have to encourage innovation, you have to encourage collaboration between teams, you have to encourage collaboration maybe outside of the organization as well, right? And agility throughout various business functions. Operating model could be redesigning organizational structures, processes, workflows to be more agile, to focus more on customer centricity, on customer value, and also data driven in the digital age, right? So, how do you make an organization data driven is by fostering digital skills and capabilities with your employees to effectively leverage and adapt new technologies, and then also influence, hence, in the way that they work together. Now, technology, again, the fourth pillar, a very important pillar, but what is often confused as the sole essence of digital transformation, involves embracing, integrating emerging digital technologies to drive innovation, to enhance efficiency, and create value for customers, to create value for stakeholders, shareholders, and everything. So let's hone in a little bit on the skills pillar, shall we? Um, this pillar almost emphasizes the importance of upskilling and reskilling your workforce to equip them with the digital competencies that are required in today's rapidly evolving digital landscape. It includes technical skills, which we do every day with a lot of digital transformation initiatives within Cubicle. Technical skills like data analytics, digital literacy, coding, as well as in some cases soft skills. Data presentation, leading and presenting data, designing KPIs through that, adaptability, creativity, and collaboration, which are essential for navigating this change. And this is why we see data literacy as a big piece of digital transformation projects across the board. Um, and in certain scenarios, it can so happen that if organizations do not focus on data literacy, a lot of digital transformation initiatives can fail. And just to even give you an example of a traditional retail chain that attempted to implement a data driven approach, but did not adequately invest in data literacy amongst its employees. And um, as a result, the employees lacked the necessary skills to make most of that investment that they made. There was misinterpretation of data, there was a resistance to change. Employees might resist adopting new processes. There can be inefficient operations just to optimize experiences due to the inability to harness the full potential of available data. And that possibly just results in missed opportunities, doesn't it? Without data literacy, employees can massively overlook valuable insights that sit within the business. And none of that would always make its way into growth and innovation within the business. Um, and with that, just to bring it back to and contextualize it to all of our attendees and audiences today, tell us a little bit about your role in the company, right? It doesn't matter where you sit in the matrix of your organization, digital disruption or digital transformation will impact you. So, what industry do you work in? What role are you in your business? And perhaps even just take a jab at what you think digital disruption means within your business. Um, Again, this could look like, even as an example of like supply chain, if you work in supply chain, drones could possibly be a very disruptive thing that could be happening in your delivery sense. So yeah, just take a jab at what you think that would mean to your organization. And we'd love to pick that apart a little bit more in the session. And with that, I am very, very excited to introduce a new face from Cubicle. It's usually me mostly leading all of these chats, but Ian is our head of business development in Cubicle, and we did the MBA at Trinity College Dublin together. So it's very nice to be working with him again here at Cubicle. And with a lot of pestering, I have finally gotten him to agree to join one of these. And he will be chatting a little bit more about all things digital disruption and digital transformation with Tony. So welcome, Ian. It's very nice to have you join us.
Thank you, Anu, and absolutely delighted to be here. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's guest, Tony Moroney. Tony is a digital transformation consultant, a member of the associate faculty at the IMI, and co-founder of the Digital Transformation Lab at UCC. He's a highly experienced international advisor on digital in respect of strategy, business model information, and transformation. Tony has an MBA from UCD, a banking MBA from Bangor University, and is a chartered fellow of both the Institute of Directors and the Chartered Institute of Marketing. And he's a regular commentator on all things digital. Tony, absolute pleasure to have you with us today, and thank you for joining.
Ian, thank you indeed. Delighted to be here.
You one MBA wasn't enough. You decided to do two.
Well, it was glutton for punishment. It was the second one was kind of a more focused one. Whereas the first one, was a general MBA, but I was doing a lot of work in financial services, and I was working in the UK, and it made sense to do it because there had been a lot of changes, particularly in ethics and everything else. So it was very much focused in terms of what's happening in financial services in the modern era.
Fantastic. And listen, I suppose just back to what Anu kind of opened up there around kind of digital transformation. And I think, certainly from my experience speaking with organizations, with executives, it means many things to many different people. I suppose just to kind of kick off, like, what does digital transformation mean to you?
Well, look, the first thing I would say is that, digital transformation for me, it's a mindset and it's a capability. I think the problem that we have in organizations is that we think of them as projects. And Anu referenced that I often ask organizations, directors, C-suite executives, etc., what do they mean by digital transformation? And I do get a range of answers. And part of the reason is because we're using words like digitization, digitalization, digital transformation, throw in innovation and reinvention as well. But we're using all these words interchangeably. And while of course they're all related, they are not the same things. So for me, digitization is transforming, what you've always done into digital. So it's no longer analog. We're no longer using paper forms. We're using digital. Digitalization is we're creating new value. Whereas digital transformation is about strategically reinventing your organization. So it's not wedded to the past. It's nearly like we're thinking about the future, and we're sort of saying, well, look, if we want to be relevant and competitive in that future, how do we get there? And that's what digital transformation is about. But, I would emphasize the word transformation is the one we should focus on, not the word digital. Because what happens in organizations is, if you're in IT, you hear digital and it means something. If you're not in IT, you hear digital and you're thinking immediately, I actually don't know a lot about IT. Right? So really what we need to do is, take it away from the domains of digital technology into, well, actually, what does this mean for the business? And how does this business need to change if it wants to be able to meet the needs of our customers today, tomorrow, and to the future? And in that context, we can address things like technology. But if we just start with technology, we are now just doing technology implementation, and the organization is not, transforming. And that's where we run into problems. So I would say, look, for me, it's around the adaptations the business makes to be competitive in a digitalized world. So adaptation is, Darwin, it's those that adapt best survive. We want to be competitive, and we're recognizing that the world we're in is digitalized and will be progressively more digitalized. Now, just one important point here, Ian, because I hear organizations say, they're talking about digital strategy. Now, to me, that's a total misnomer. We have a strategy, and that strategy should have a digital perspective. Right? We don't have a separate digital strategy unless we got a separate digital organization somewhere else. We have one strategy, and that strategy contains a digital perspective. If we start talking about digital strategy now we're confusing the organization, because well, which strategy is more important, right? The core business, the digital business. So I think for me, it's around, it's a mindset about how we think about the business, recognizing that the world is changing, that there is, of course, pervasive use of technologies. The expectations will be different, but we want to be relevant. So what do we need to do, and how do we get there?
Yeah, it's a very good point. And I suppose you mentioned there just around obviously the world is changing, technology is evolving as well. But I suppose when an organization kind of embarks on that journey, like what are some of the kind of key drivers? Like what are the challenges? What are the needs? Like how does this all begin?
Well, I love asking this question of organizations. I say to them, if you were starting again today, would you do it the same way? I have yet to find anyone to say yes. I mean, the reality is, look, every organization when it starts understands its market, it understands its business, it understands its customers. But that was point in time. The world has moved on. And now what we need to do is sort of say, well, okay, if we look at our customers and their changing expectations, if we look at the type of tools and technologies customers are using, do we understand how they're using those and what implications that has in terms of the service they will expect from us? Do we understand the changes in demographics and everything else? So I would say, look, it's multifaceted. The technology, of course, gets the headlines because if it's not generative AI or the metaverse the year before, they make big headlines. But what we need to really understand is, put it in simple terms. If 70% of 13-year-olds are using Roblox, and TikTok is the #1 downloaded app for the last couple of years, how many organizations actually understand how those customers are using those technologies and what that might mean in terms of the service they will expect when they come into the job market, when they are customers, when they are SMEs dealing with you, etc. So what we need to all the time think about is, look, the world is on a continuous line of disruption, and there will always be some new disruption, not just technology. There will always be new disruptions. So we need to be thinking about, do we have a sense of, do we have the foresight? And this is important because most organizations, they always talk in hindsight, how we got to where we got to from where we started, and which is really interesting, and it's very important in terms of the values of the organization. They also talk then in terms of, well, what's going on in the market, but everyone knows what's going on in the market. I mean, there isn't a person who hasn't heard of generative AI. So just hearing about generative AI doesn't give you a competitive advantage. Right? The competitive advantage comes from thinking into the future and sort of saying, well, what does that future look like? And how do we get there? Right? And that's what's important, because it's not a case of incremental improvements, because where we came from might have been important at a point in time, but it's not necessarily the right path to get us to where we want to get to. And I think we obsess in holding on to the past and incrementally changing it, where actually sometimes we would be better off sort of saying, yeah, let's understand the past and let's understand what's important in terms of our heritage and our values. But now let's paint a picture of what this future might look like, and let's understand that gap in terms of how do we need to transform if we want to be successful in that world.
Yeah, good point. And I suppose just on that point as well, I know we're kind of catching up beforehand. Like you mentioned, in terms of, I suppose, digital transformation or digital transformation initiatives, and I was actually quite surprised by the statistic, but you mentioned that 80% of these initiatives typically fail.
Yeah.
I suppose, how do organizations kind of mitigate that risk, and why such a high failure rate?
Well, look, the simple answer is, most organizations don't set out to transform; they set out to do some sort of digital implementation. Um, I think when you look at organizations, it's very easy if I say to you, look, Ian, let's automate that process there, and it'll be 20% more efficient. We'll need one less person doing it, and the service levels will be great. They'll be up by whatever 10%. So we can run the slide rule over that and sort of say, actually, yeah, the payback on that is fantastic, or the IRR, or whatever metric we want to use. But if we say, actually, we're going to think differently about this organization, and we're going to, you have a different mindset that's, customer in. We're going to think end to end. We're going to, change how we do things so that we are preempting customers' needs and giving them a great experience. And that includes changing, our culture, our skill set, all those type of things. Well, organizations struggle to put a return on that, right? Because it's hard to get your arms around it. Now, the alternative is, the cost of not doing it means, you may actually go out of business. So I see there's a real challenge here for organizations in, one, they haven't defined digital transformation, but yet they're doing it. Two is, they're using metrics that, probably don't help them understand whether transformation is working or not, right? And three, and most importantly, is they're not committed to transformation, right? So transformation, I've seen it all over the world where transformation is it's kind of, well, look, we better be seen to do digital transformation. I know we haven't defined it, but we better be seen to doing it, right? And a real telling question I often ask is, well, so who's responsible for digital transformation? And they say, oh, that's Ian. And I said, all right, so does Ian have the budget and mandate to change the organization? And invariably the answer is no, but he's working on these projects. To which I respond, well, so he's not responsible for digital transformation, he's responsible for these projects, right? So, digital transformation needs to be owned from the top. It needs to be led from the bottom, because look, one of the big changes that we need to accept is, if we think of boards of directors or C-suite executives, in the main, they were born pre the internet and born pre the smartphone. Right? Right? So being a digital native is not something that they are. It didn't happen. Right? They were born too early. Right?
Yeah.
They have loads of digital natives working in their organizations, and I sometimes hear, well, 30 years experience. Yeah, but that was for a different world. That 30 years may not be relevant anymore. What we need to do as leaders, we need to sort of say is, well, look, the answers are in the organization. What we need to do is create the environment where those answers can percolate up to the top. And we need to let go, because I can't be expected to have all the answers, particularly in a fast-moving, disruptive world. But what I am expected to do is understand, how that's going to impact our business, and also understand how can I get those answers to come up through the organization and make sure that the organization responds appropriately, right? So I don't have to have all the answers, but I do need to create the environment, and I do need to ask the questions.
Really good point. And I suppose something that you mentioned there is just around, obviously you mentioned kind of who owns it, but I suppose how important is understanding the kind of like, what are the KPIs, what are the measures, what are our kind of desired outcomes, and like, how do you bring everyone along in that journey in terms of, impact? Are we on track? Are we not on track? What do we need to change?
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. I mean, look, the first thing I'd say is most organizations talk about digital transformation, and then they don't change the metrics, they don't change the agenda, they don't change the performance goals, they don't change the rewards, and then they wonder why people aren't focused on it. Well, because you haven't actually created an environment where they are focused on it. So it's really important. Digital transformation is not something you can mandate into an organization. People either want to embrace digital transformation or they don't. And if you just stand up and say, we're doing digital transformation because, the world is going digital and we need to be more digital, your people will leave that meeting, and what will go through their mind, pretty fast afterwards is, will I have a job? or what does this mean for me and my department? Are management actually talking about, automation here and right sizing and all those type of things? And really what is missing in a lot of cases is this shared vision. So the leaders, added and communicating in terms of, look, here's how our business is going to change and what it means for our stakeholders, for our customers, and for you. And here's how we're going to improve your skills so that you're part of this organization and delivering on the vision that we have for it. Because if you can't see a future for the organization, or if you can't see a future for yourself in that organization, why would you embrace it? Now, there's another important point here in terms of, I call it the digital divide. So we have loads of digital divides, but within organizations, you can very easily create a digital divide where, the senior executives, the penny drops and they're saying, oh, we need to do digital transformation. And your young digital natives are saying, well, why didn't we do this 5 years ago? Right? But your middle management, if you want to call it that, right? They're now feeling very uncomfortable because they don't know what digital transformation means because no one has explained it to them, right? They're having all of these thoughts in terms of automation and everything else. Who is it that our digital natives talk to every day? It's that middle management. Right? So what we need to do is invest in our people so there's this shared understanding. So everyone understands what we mean by digital transformation, what success will look like, how we're measuring it, what the KPIs are, right? And how they themselves are going to be part of this journey. Because otherwise, it's like the organ transplant. You get a new heart and the body says, no, thanks.
It's a very good point. And I think what you mentioned there around, I suppose, silos in organizations, and obviously the importance of communication is kind of imperative. But I suppose back to the start of the conversation, when you're talking about kind of board level, I mean, you need to kind of have that kind of buy-in right at the top. That kind of transcends down through the whole organization. If you don't have that, you really kind of have challenges throughout the whole company,
Yeah, no, you're right. But I think I'm always amused on this one, Ian, because silos are one of these things. So when organizations are small, it's all hands on deck. And then as organizations get bigger, well, we better specialize and we'll create specialized functions so that we can be more efficient. Right? And we focus on the efficiency of the silos as opposed to the customer. And now, the internal structure, that's something that the organization cares about. The customer couldn't care less. The customer is interested in doing whatever it is they're trying to do. Right? But these silos get in the way because, power and politics and all these things come into play. And look, with digital transformation, quite often you're removing, parts of the process. Maybe you're removing silos. You might be doing a whole host of change which interferes with the power base. So what we need to do is make sure that, one, if we're going to have silos, they work seamlessly together with a customer in mind, not the department in mind. Right? So if you think of the disruptors, what do they set out to do? Not to copy what someone else is doing and make it more efficient. They set out to transform and disrupt and deliver a much superior customer experience. So if there's silos there, they need to work seamlessly. But the other thing we need to avoid, right, is creating new digital silos. Right. So we used to have, sales, operations, whatever it might be, credit, risk, compliance. But now let's put in a new one called digital. And to compound it, what we'll do is let's appoint heads of digital, so heads of digital products and heads of digital channels, etc. Now that's a silo. Right? Surely we should be saying, actually, let's have a head of customers, and within that domain, right? Some customers will want to deal through digital, some will want to deal through mobile, whatever it might be. But we have customers, right? We don't have silos that are competing with each other for scarce resources, be it people or capital or access to resources, etc. Right? So we put it in context. In the second industrial revolution, there was heads of electricity. And I don't see jobs on LinkedIn for heads of electricity anymore. Right? But I see plenty for heads of digital. And I think we need to really ask ourselves, right, are we just creating problems for ourselves where actually we've now created an internal competition, between traditional and digital, which is actually, causing further roadblocks in terms of the ability of the organization to transform.
You mentioned like there's two key points you mentioned there. Obviously, kind of breaking down silos and having, you know, that kind of customer-centric approach. If you look at, I mean, and you have the benefit from, you know, academia and also from a professional corporate background as well. But if you look at global organizations that have done this extremely well, you know, who would they be and what have they done?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question because I often get asked this, particularly in the IMI, I get asked the question, yeah, but it's all very easy for Google and Amazon and all these companies, you know, they started out that way. And reality is Amazon didn't, neither did Netflix. They were just pipeline businesses that, you know, I mean, you know, Netflix was selling DVDs out in the post and Amazon was selling books via the internet. I mean, those companies are unrecognizable now. But when I look at one of my favorite is DBS Bank in Singapore. And, you know, it's a very interesting case in that this was a development bank, state-owned, that was, you know, bureaucratic. It was notoriously slow. It couldn't make decisions to save its life. And they appointed a new chief executive. And, you know, 10 years later, you know, they have, you know, taken all the accolades in terms of the most digital bank, the world's best bank, the most innovative bank, you name it, several years running. Now, what is important, Ian, is that they set out to transform. Now, there's a great story about the CEO, Pirish Gupta, meeting Jack Ma from Alibaba in 2013. 1 hour meeting, and he came back and said, oh, we're in big trouble. And he convinced his board that they needed to digitally transform or they would not exist. And the board backed the executive team to make it happen. Now, what's important is, you know, they came up with this, you know, strategy called Make Banking Joyful, right? Because apparently there was an article in one of the magazines at the time that said people prefer root canal than with the dentist rather than banking. But they came up, Make Banking Joyful. And that became the corporate mantra, but it also accounted for 20% of the corporate goals. And so you were asking about metrics and whatnot. So in their organization, you know, 50% of their you know, corporate goals were strategic and 50% were operational. So they immediately changed that and said, no, it'll be 40, 40 and 20% for transformation. And so there's no ambiguity. 20% of all our goals are in transformation, right? That fed its whole way through the system in terms of performance reviews, everything, right? They did a few other important things as well, though. They also said, well, actually, if we want to be this customer-centric digital organization that you referenced a second ago, every executive must sponsor customer journeys. And so every single senior leader in the organization had to take responsibility for a customer journey. Now, in my experience in most organizations, you know, the more senior they are and the bigger the organization, the more detached they are from the customer. In this case, they actually had to sponsor the journeys, each one of them. So maybe I had savings and you had loans and someone else had whatever. Right? Now, but if I understand one customer journey, intuitively, I understand all customer journeys because I've been trained to understand customer journeys. Right? My role as a senior executive, right, is actually very easy. It's to remove the roadblocks. Right? So when the team has a problem with the customer journey, as a senior executive, I have the power to remove those roadblocks. Right? Now, in most organizations, they're too far removed to actually understand what those roadblocks are. But here now they have hands-on visibility of the customer journey. The other thing they did, and it's to your point on silos, they said it's two in a pod, so business and IT joined at the hip. And so let's say I'm responsible for IT and you're responsible for business. And if I'm on holidays, you need to be able to answer all the questions to do with IT and vice versa, right? So they started working collaboratively. And it wasn't about my goals vis-a-vis your goals. These were our goals. And remember, the mantra of the organization is to make banking joyful. Now, look, they translated that for the customer into, you know, live more, bank less, because customers didn't understand what that meant. But they did another few things. So what they said was, look, if we think about this in terms of how we're going to create the mindset throughout the organization, they needed to simplify it. So they had three goals, three overarching goals. One was to be, you know, become digital to the core. And they used this, you know, acronym Gandalf, you know, the guy, the wizard from, you know, the movies, the Lord of the Rings. But, you know, the G was Google, the A was Apple, and you know, so on and so forth. So they went to see Google, Apple, Amazon, you know, Facebook, Netflix to understand how these companies were using digital tools and technologies to deliver on their experience. And then they sort of said, okay, in our context, what does that mean? And that started to shape how they thought about, supporting the organization achieve its goals. The second area they focused on was, being there for the customer in a almost invisible way. So, they came to the conclusion that, look, customers don't wake up saying, I wonder what I can do with the bank today. Customers wake up and they kind of say, well, actually, I'm thinking of buying a house, or I want to change my car, or I need to do something about the children's education. And what they did was they set out to embed themselves in those journeys so that they became the default. Right? So they just made it so easy for the customer to do whatever they wanted to do. Now, the third one is really interesting. It's, how do you think like a 22,000 person startup? Right? Now, back to our earlier conversation in terms of small businesses, they understand everything because it's all hands on deck, right? Well, you're 22,000 people in the organization. How do you get a mindset that thinks like a startup? So they had to do a number of things in terms of, putting a focus on, agility, focus on learning. And I love this one. You didn't have to get approval to go on a learning course, but when you came back, you had to train all your colleagues on what you learned. Right? So they actually created a network effects on learning, right? They had to create the environment where people could take risks, right? So that meant, psychological safety. Now, psychological safety is not a one-way street. It's about, creating the framework where people actually can bring forward and they can experiment within boundaries, right? So it's not a free-for-all. They also had to shift the focus to data. Now, data is a mindset. It's not a set of numbers, and it's not a technology program. And a new reference, CRM. That's what. Yeah, they might help you with your data, but it's a mindset issue. Have you got the mindset that's going to use data? And when you think of Amazon, Jeff Bezos started life as a data analyst on Wall Street. Amazon is obsessed with customer data, even since he left. So they had to change a lot of things in terms of how they thought about the business. Now, one of the things they said was that one of their biggest challenges was to stop the bankers thinking like bankers. And so have them think instead in terms of, well, what are customers trying to do in their lives? And I think that's a really important point, because regardless of what industry you're in, and the word industry in fact is it's nearly irrelevant at this stage, because your competition can come from anywhere. Anyone can compete with you. They don't have to have a background in your business. In fact, the less background they have, the more innovative and disruptive they are likely to be. Right? So it's around thinking about, if we think about customers and we think about what customers are trying to do, well, where do we fit into those customers' lives? And then how do we make it so simple that by default they want to deal with us because it's a great experience and they love dealing with us? I mean, that's what it's about. So to me, DBS is a great case study on a number of fronts, but probably most importantly because it was a very traditional, organization that transformed over, and it didn't happen overnight. It took time. It transformed over a period of time, a couple of years, to be one of the best organizations in the world. And I think it's in the Harvard top 10 in terms of case studies for digital transformation.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I think the one thing that kind of stuck out for me was they kind of approached it from a position of strength. I think at the time they had record profits. The company was kind of booming. You mentioned obviously 22,000 employees, but they saw a number of kind of startups kind of entering this space. So in terms of kind of competitive advantage, they saw that potentially being eroded. And from that perspective, I think it's incredibly impressive. And Tony, what I might just do is I might just kind of pause for a second, and there's a few kind of questions and kind of comments coming into the chat. But there's one here that's actually quite interesting, and it's probably back to the point we're making earlier on. But how do you kind of approach balancing short-term wins with longer-term digital transformation goals?
So it's a very, very good question. And so look, to my mind, you need to make sure you have built in a number of early wins, because no one is going to wait 3 years to see is it working. Right? And sometimes what happens is organizations, they set out the big goals, and then people can't see progress and then they lose heart. And or someone starts saying, well, hang on, why are we spending money on this? Because we're not seeing any return. And so it's important that you build in, a number of, reasonably early wins into this, because that does a few things. It shows it can work. Right? It builds confidence, in the employees, but also in, the board or the investors or the executive or whatever, because, they can see, oh, actually, this is working, right? But it also shows a commitment to a path of, and you mentioned, that, this is an ongoing process. So look, we should have a direction of travel. Now, some of our assumptions we will get wrong or the market will change, but the direction of travel should be broadly right. But we need to make sure that we're showing we're making progress, right? So if we say, yeah, look, come back to us in 3 years, it's going to be a very short meeting, right? No one's going to approve that. But if we can sort of say, well, look, we're not going to start by just sort of saying, look, here's some low-hanging fruit, as they like to say in business, right? No, what we want to say is, look, we have a vision of where we're trying to bring this organization. But on that pathway, right, we can see some things that we can actually implement pretty quick and bring about benefit, right? But we know they're on the pathway, right? It's not look. Sometimes I use the analogy, the plane flying to New York. So we know it's going to New York. We know it won't go in a straight line because there's storms and all that sort of stuff. But at least we know it's going to New York. But back to the start of our conversation, what if some of our people think we're going to Hong Kong, and some of our others think we're going to Paris, and a few others think we're going to Dubai? Now you have the organization all over the place, and no one actually knows what progress has been made, or in fact, where we're actually going. So I think be clear on the vision, show that there is a roadmap, if you want to call it that, but also then show that actually we are making progress, continuous progress. And then it's like everything else, winning becomes a habit. People start to see, actually, this is working. Oh, look at the results that we're getting from this. So look at the feedback we're getting from customers, or look at how better my job is, right? Now you're starting to get commitment and momentum, because, it's like that plane going to New York. If it doesn't get enough momentum, it won't get off the runway. You need to have the, early wins so people say, this is working. Actually, this is quite exciting. And you know what we're doing next, right? So they can see it and they can start to, feel the progress.
Yeah. And who's, I suppose, just on that point as well, I mean, who's ultimately responsible? Like, is it shared ownership across the business? Is it at board level? Is it at management level? Like, what's your viewpoint on that?
Well, look, I think absolutely. I mean, look, the board ultimately is responsible for strategy. So, the board should absolutely own it, and they should, be working with the executive to make sure it happens. I think within the executive team, it must be owned by the CEO, and but the CEO must have total commitment from the top team, because organizations are unbelievably good at identifying chinks in the armor. And so let's say we're on the exec team, and you're gung ho. You love this. This is something you think is fantastic, right? And I'm not keen on it. I can kill it by doing absolutely nothing. No one will ever be able to say that I said anything bad about it. But the fact that I never talk about it, the fact that it's never on the agenda, the fact that I have no metrics in my team or anything like that, sends a message to everyone in my part of the organization that this does not matter. Right? So, to my mind, the CEO is absolutely key, but in conjunction with the whole top leadership team. So it's a collective thing where it doesn't matter who you talk to, right? It's the same focus in terms of where this organization is going and what digital transformation means and how we're going to get there.
It's a good point. And I think there's actually, funny enough, there's a comment here from Burgle, earlier comment, just around, I loved making banking joyful, focusing on the customer experience. What about the employee experience and other stakeholders' experience? I know you mentioned there just around, like, in terms of kind of wins, getting feedback kind of internally from different stakeholders across the business. And that's essentially how you kind of drive it forward,
Yeah, well, I mean, look, there was work done by Harvard many years ago, and their service profit shame, and what they showed was that, satisfied employees made satisfied customers, made sustainable profits. And in the case of DBS, I mean, there's some great case studies where, they were having problems going into markets, and you had risk and compliance and other people coming forward with ideas because the whole bank was committed to making banking joyful, right? So I think when you remove the silos and you have people collectively focused on an ambition to make banking joyful, right? Now you have something where we're all on the same team here. Right? And if you're empowering your people and you're giving them the psychological safety to experiment, you're enabling them to decide what training they need. And as I say, the quid pro quo is you have to train your fellow employees, but you're really creating that environment where people can actually make transformation happen. Right? Now, what's interesting is at one stage, I think they set out to remove 1 million hours of processing time, and someone said, well, hold on, should we not be removing 1 million hours of customer processing time? And they said, you're right. So they removed 10 million. Right? So it's creating that burning platform, as you want to call it that, but this focus on, we're really clear on how we want to transform. And that drives everything. But when you have a situation, though, where people think digital transformation might mean automation or right sizing, and they've no idea where it's going or what it means for them, that's when you get your 80% failure. And to my mind, that's incumbent on the board and the CEO and the top leadership team to make sure that they're creating the environment. They don't have to have the answers. They certainly need to have answers in terms of the vision, but they don't have to have all the detail, because quite often the answers are coming up through the organization once people are bought into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose it'd be interesting just to kind of get your takeaway. I mean, there's obviously a number of people on today's webinar, probably at kind of different stages in terms of their digital transformation maturity. But just to kind of sum up, like, could you give kind of 3 key takeaways or kind of pieces of advice based on what we've discussed today? Like, what would you advise people to do in terms of digital transformation? What should they kind of focus on? What are the kind of outcomes that they could kind of look for? And obviously as well, from maybe a cultural perspective and tooling perspective.
Yeah, well, look, the first thing is, there must be a vision and there must be an understanding of what digital transformation means in the context of that vision. I would say, put an X through digital and focus on transformation, but in that context, focus on how we're going to transform and build your roadmap using the how we're going to transform, and build your metrics around that as well. And most importantly, this is a people initiative, right? Because without the people, it's not going to work. Right? I can stand up on the podium and say we're doing digital transformation, and everyone say that's great, and go off and do what they were doing yesterday. Right? We have to bring the people with us, and they have to see, that there is a future for the organization and themselves. Wouldn't it be much better if you yourself were saying, wow, this organization has a vision for the future. It's very exciting. And I have a role to play in that if I so wish. I may decide I want to move on, but I'm going to move on with new skills because they're going to train me and they're going to make sure that, I'm fit for purpose, in the digital economy. But I can see that this is real and that there's a commitment, because look, what happens in organizations is they make all sort of announcements, and then, then something like digital transformation comes along and here we go again. And, these uses of says, if we sit this one out 3 months, it'll be gone too, right? Yeah. So you get organization fatigue because you get all sort of initiatives that are not thought through, they're not joined up, the metrics don't support them, nothing supports it, but they're imposed on the organization. So I've been in loads of organizations over the years where, there's technology implementation that no one uses. Why? Because, well, no one actually figured out, well, why they should use it to start with. No one got any buy-in in terms of, well, why this would be a good idea, or even asked, actually, how can we help you create a great experience, right? And here's some technology that's in answer to your question. So we tend to, as organizations, impose stuff because it seems like a good idea. And I think, for me, we're gone past that. And the rate of technological change means that, someone from somewhere can actually disrupt your business. You won't even see it coming. But the problem is, if that happens, it's too late. And so you're better off to actually take the time and sort of say, yeah, in 3, 4, 5 years' time, the world we think will look like this. That means this is the type of service we think we would need to have to deliver it, or whatever it might be. And then you sort of say, but how would we get there? You know, how would we change? How would we change our skills, our mindset? And look, mindset's really important, because if I don't think differently about the business, I don't act differently in the business. And if I don't act differently in the business, the culture doesn't change, right? And quite often what I see is you get digital initiatives imposed on analog organizations. And it's only a matter of time before the digital initiative, peters out or is sidelined or whatever. And so, it's really important that you have a joined up view, but that everyone is on the journey with you.
I love your point. Like, I think culture is imperative, but I think your point around empowerment and psychological safety, especially, I think is kind of very appropriate. Tony, I know we're kind of approaching the end of time, but just before we do so, I'd love to kind of get your takeaway. I know you're away in Barcelona there kind of last week, but just in terms of kind of technology, data literacy, data tooling, what did you kind of see at the kind of conference? Love if you could share some insights around that.
Yeah, well, look, actually, I was in Barcelona, as you say, for the Mobile World Congress, and the month before I was in Las Vegas for the Consumer Electronics Show, and I think there's a key theme running through all of this, and I think the key theme is that there are loads of digital disruptions, if you want to call it that, right? From AI, generative AI, 5.5G or 5G advanced, metaverse, spatial computing. But really what we're starting to see is a convergence of all these things. And I think, part of the problem for organizations is if you look at all these things in isolation, you sort of say, oh, well, the metaverse doesn't really matter. Right? Well, actually, but if you put it in the context of, advanced telecommunications, high speed, low latency, generative AI and data and this and they're all coming together. Certainly, you're thinking of a very, very different world. I think the other one that one of the talks I was at in Barcelona, there was a guy talking, and he was saying that, look, it's no longer about data and AI. It's data for AI and AI for data. And again, it's around mindset change in terms of actually, now we need to be thinking about, I mean, I talk to organizations that have loads of data and they don't use any of it, right? But what they're basically saying is, look, you need to be thinking about all of these things coming together and how, the confluence of them are going to drive your business, or not, as it might be, but someone is going to use it to drive the business. And you might as well be there ahead of them and doing something with it. And, one of the most important things I would say is, look, we all need to upskill. And that doesn't mean that, you need to understand how to write algorithms. But you need to understand, what is the potential impact of the algorithm on the business and how that might drive outcomes for stakeholders, including customers and employees in the business. And so we don't need to be the technologists, but we do need to have a sense of, here's what's happening, here's where it's going, here's how things are coming together, here's what that might actually mean for our organization or for our business model, right? And how well prepared are we for that? And that starts with transforming ourselves, because the organization is, at the end of the day, it's made up of people, right? And if we can't transform ourselves, well, how are we going to lead our people through transformation?
Absolutely. And Tony, thoroughly enjoyed our chat today, and thank you so much for joining us. Great to kind of get your insights. Maybe you could come back to us in maybe kind of 3 or 4 months' time and join another panel if you're open to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love talking about digital disruption.
Fantastic. And listen, thank you for everyone attending today's call. We will be actually sending out a recording of today's webinar. And for anyone interested in upskilling, as Tony was talking about there, or data literacy training, they can obviously visit cubicle.com. Tony will be sharing your details as well and the follow-up. So if anyone wants to reach out to you, they can obviously find you on LinkedIn as well.
Super. Thank you, Ian.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. Great to see you again.
Cheers. Thanks, Sam.
Take care. Bye-bye.